is about an incident that occurred in a forest in Lopburi province. At that time, it seemed that the person in question had to travel to carry out a mission to survey the forest in preparation for training military students. Local villagers had warned them not to enter the forest at that time, but due to disbelief in the villagers' warnings, they ended up encountering strange events, and eventually, a loss occurred in a story titled Not Believing Yet Following. Music before we dive into our eerie story. I'd like to ask all viewers to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring spine-chilling tales. For today, I am presenting the spooky experiences of Sergeant Nook, which he shared on the Ghost Radio program in 2017. In the form of a scary story for all of you to watch and listen to, the story involves events that happened to Sergeant Nook himself during his duty in a certain forest. Must say beforehand that this story involves a loss, so I want to express my condolences to the family of the deceased in this incident. Let's go back to around 2010, when Sergeant Nook was tasked with training commando students in Lopburi province. This course was a field training where Sergeant Nook was responsible for overseeing the entire training. Military students would be divided into groups of 40, and the training required these students to be left in the forest and use their skills to survive and get out within a specified time, which was about 2 days. If they could not exit the forest within 2 days, they would be considered to have failed the commando training before the departure day. Sergeant Nook and the other trainers, about 3 people, went to contact the local villagers to use the forest area for training. This forest was near the villagers' agricultural land, and it was state-owned land allowing villagers to farm. Sergeant Nook explained the details of the training to the villagers, mentioning that they could not specify the exact duration of the training. However, the course required students to survive in the forest within 48 hours. The villagers advised Sergeant Nook and his team not to conduct the training in the forest at this time. Sergeant Nook then asked why, considering they had conducted similar training every year in the past. The villagers explained that they didn't want the training to occur now because it was the end of the rainy season and the beginning of the cool season. Normally, no one ventured into the forest at that time. One villager, who had previously worked as a guide into the forest, emphasized that during this period, the forest would be dense and unmanageable, and no one would be able to guide them up the mountain. Upon hearing this, Sergeant Nook suggested that instead of letting the students hike up, they could use helicopters to drop the students at the designated location and then descend from the forest to check if it was safe. If they could safely come down, the villagers would have to guide the trainers up to the students. The villagers agreed to this proposal. After understanding the situation, Sergeant Nook went to find soldiers in Lopburi to see if anyone had previously used the designated drop-off point for training. A soldier from 2 years prior confirmed that he had used this area for training and volunteered to guide them. On the day of departure, around 9 a.m., everyone gathered at the base of the mountain. The team for the reconnaissance included Sergeant Nook and 2 sergeants. They traveled by helicopter to the drop-off point, which took about half an hour. When they arrived at the destination on the mountain, it was around 9 a.m. They began surveying the area, starting with the drop-off point to check if it was suitable and safe. They spent the whole day surveying the surroundings. Around 5 p.m., they started testing if there were any dangerous animals or hazards in the forest at night, as the villagers had feared. They set up camp and lived like the students would during the training to see if they could survive. That night, Sergeant Nook and the 2 sergeants slept in separate tents around 8 p.m. They discussed that there shouldn't be any issues and agreed to split up the next day to hike down the mountain, meeting again at the base. They talked until around 9 p.m. The atmosphere at the top of the mountain was very quiet. Suddenly, they heard a distant sound carried by the wind, resembling a festival noise. Sergeant Nook remarked to his colleagues that if there was a festival, they were too far away for the sound to reach them. One sergeant added that the area they surveyed had no nearby villages. They chose this location specifically to avoid training near communities, to prevent students from seeking help from locals. After hearing the strange noise, they decided to climb higher to get a better view. They ascended about 1 kilometer and soon the noise disappeared. The only sound left was their own heavy breathing. They were puzzled puzzled because if there was indeed a festival or entertainment nearby, they should have seen lights or something from the highest point on the mountain. It was indeed like that, but now they didn't see or hear anything at all. Feeling uneasy, Sergeant Nook and the team decided to walk down to the campsite. The three of them turned around and walked back along the same path amidst the absolute silence of the forest, which was so quiet that they could hear their own breathing. The weather at that time was not worth mentioning. It was so cold that it made their arm hairs stand up like thorns. As everyone slowly walked back to their campsite, Sergeant Nook mentioned that they hadn't counted each other but had been using glances to check. Then one sergeant, whom I'll refer to as Sergeant K, spoke up amidst the silence, asking if they were all three present or if someone was missing. Upon hearing this, Sergeant Nook quickly warned him not to speak like that in the forest. Such things aren't said here. After that, another sergeant whispered to Sergeant Nook that he felt like someone was following them. Sergeant Nook replied that he also heard a similar sound of footsteps, but wasn't sure if he heard it for real. The sound they heard seemed like someone walking on twigs, making a crunching noise from behind them. When the group of Sergeant Nook stopped walking, it seemed like the sound stopped as well. At that moment, no one thought of ghosts. They just wondered if there were animals or something following them. They decided to continue, walking quietly, each step mindful of whether the strange sound would occur again. Sergeant Nook said that as they started walking again, the mysterious footsteps did indeed resume, sounding like someone walking barefoot on twigs, clearly different from their own footsteps since they were all wearing shoes. When they reached the campsite, everyone remained silent and quickly went to rest. Around 2 a.m., after everyone had fallen asleep, Sergeant Nook woke up because he heard what sounded like a group of people walking around their campsite. The footsteps were the same as the ones they heard while walking down the hill. Sergeant Nook, who was already inclined to believe in the supernatural, suspected that the group of people he saw was not human. He remained still in his sleeping bag, while the group seemed to be moving closer and closer to their sleeping area. The shadows cast by the campfire fell on his sleeping bag. Sergeant Nook decided to get up, gritting his teeth, and when he looked around, the group of people he had seen earlier was no longer there. Not long after, one of the people who had been sleeping got up and came out of the tent to tell Sergeant Nook that he had also heard strange noises since midnight, leading them to decide not to sleep anymore for fear of losing their nerve. They decided to sit and talk instead. At that time, one of the sergeants shared that he had heard a sound like someone kicking the tent stakes and speculated that the noise could not be from an animal because instinctively animals would not come near a campfire. Upon hearing this, Sergeant Nook immediately suggested that they might be encountering what the locals had warned about before, which led Sergeant K to challenge the situation, saying there was nothing to be afraid of and that he would handle it. To Sergeant K's challenge, a senior sergeant advised caution, reminding them that they were in the forest, not at home, and warned them that there might be things they were not aware of. Sergeant Nook then confessed that he had forgotten to perform the ritual to enter the forest and had not brought any ceremonial items for the forest spirits. They agreed to perform the ritual the next morning by catching fish to offer as a ceremonial offering, as Sergeant Nook thought that requesting assistance from the unit would make it feel less like a real training experience. Instead, they decided to catch fish as agreed. The next morning, they caught around 6 to 7 fish, which were then offered as a ceremonial offering. However, Sergeant K seemed to be skeptical about these matters and said that it was unnecessary and that they should just hurry up and leave. After completing the ritual, they quickly packed their things to descend the mountain, planning to split into 3 separate paths as agreed. They reached the meeting point after separating for a while. It was around 5 p.m. Sergeant Nook realized they would not make it to the base of the mountain by then and requested an extra day for the survey. The unit had no problem with this and even emphasized that they should conduct a thorough investigation. Sergeant Nook requested an additional 2 to 3 days to ensure nothing would happen to the trainees. As night fell at around 6 p.m., Sergeant Nook built a fire and set up his hammock as usual, while performing a ritual to ask for permission from the local spirits. Around 2 a.m., after everyone had gone to sleep, there was suddenly a sound of footsteps, similar to the night before, but this time coming from the direction Sergeant Nook had descended from earlier that day. Then someone's voice was heard saying, "I'm burning, burning me." Hearing this, Sergeant Nook shouted, asking what was burning, thinking it was one of the sergeants speaking. When he looked out of his hammock, he saw Sergeant K waving and shaking his head to signal that he had not spoken. Sergeant Nook decided to lie down again. For a while, Sergeant Nook was startled awake by some noises and saw Sergeant K getting up because he needed to relieve himself. Sergeant K went to a large tree, which Sergeant Nook didn't notice during the day, to do his business. After Sergeant K finished, he returned to his tent. About an hour later, Sergeant K suddenly jumped up in his tent, causing the tent to collapse onto the ground. Seeing this, Sergeant Nook asked what happened. Sergeant K then explained that he had a dream where someone pointed at him and asked why he urinated at the sacred tree which had been protected for hundreds of years. The voice in the dream threatened to follow him no matter where he went, in any realm or life. Sergeant K recounted this with fear, prompting Sergeant Nook to calm him down and ask where he had urinated. When Sergeant Nook checked the spot, he saw that it was a large chandra tree and found offerings and broken figurines placed around it. Sergeant Nook deduced that it was a shrine, set up by local people who farm and fished in that area. Sergeant Nook took Sergeant K to apologize before returning to sleep. For some time, while Sergeant Nook was asleep, the rope tying his hammock to the tree slipped down to the ground. Even though he had tied it tightly, the ends of the other two sergeants seemed to have their pegs pulled out. Sergeant K grabbed his ritual knife and stuck it into the ground, declaring that no one should disturb the soldiers' area. But surprisingly, the knife couldn't penetrate the ground, which was not hard. Seeing the situation, Sergeant Nook decided to act. It's better to make a proper apology because doing this is challenging his authority. For that, no one dared to close their eyes, and they agreed that they would hurry down the mountain the next day, thinking they might not survive. The next morning, everyone set out to leave the forest, but due to the considerable distance, they only managed to get to the foothills. At that point, everyone decided not to radio for help as they thought they had reached the foothills, and it was unlikely there would be any further concerns. They then set up camp and spent the night at the foothills in the evening. After setting up their camp, they went fishing in a nearby water source and cooked the fish they caught for dinner. According to Jackal, while he was scaling the fish, he heard a sound coming from the fish that resembled a human's moan of pain. Shocked by this, he threw the fish back into the water. Jackal then suggested that they should go back because he thought things might be getting worse. However, due to Sergeant Jackal's pride, he insisted on staying until they completed the survey. After dinner and completing their personal tasks, everyone went to bed as usual. Around 10 p.m., an unusual silence fell with no sounds of animals or insects at all. Around 2 a.m., Sergeant Nook woke up to change the guard and let the previous guard sleep in the tent. He noticed that Jackal's tent zipper was open and upon checking found that no one was inside the tent. Sergeant Nook decided to report this to the other sergeant who had just changed shifts. Both of them then began searching for Jackal using flashlights due to the darkness of the area. They could see nothing. They called out Jackal's name, but unlike usual, the echoed response was from an elderly person, saying, "I am with you." The voice was very loud. Hearing this, Sergeant Nook and the others were startled and radioed for help. The unit replied that they would come immediately as the location was not far from them. At that time, the unit asked Sergeant Nook if they had sent people to search for his group. Sergeant Nook was surprised and asked why. The unit informed him that during their previous helicopter drop-off, they had seen Jackal with no shadow, while Sergeant Nook and the other sergeant had normal shadows. Sergeant Nook replied that they had not yet seen any additional units sent to them. He and the other sergeant returned to their tent and lit a fire, leaving a note saying to wait at that spot in case Jackal returned and saw the note. While Sergeant Nook and the other sergeant were searching, they walked to the water source where they had previously fished and found boot prints leading into the water. The other sergeant said it was likely boot prints rather than combat boots. Sergeant Nook noted that combat boot prints and boot prints were quite similar. They discussed whether to investigate further but decided it was too dark and returned to the tent to wait for reinforcements. For a short time, Sergeant Nook saw a group of 7 to 8 people walking past the edge of the forest. They thought this might be the reinforcements, so they signaled and called out. However, past them as if they did not hear them. Sergeant Nook decided to fire his gun into the air, but the group continued walking as if they did not hear the shots at that moment. Sergeant Nook was uncertain if they were indeed reinforcements, due to the dark environment, and only saw the group's flashlight beams. It was unlikely they were locals since no villagers would walk into the forest at that time. Sergeant Nook and the others returned to their tent and were again puzzled when they suddenly lost all radio signals. Even though they had been in contact with the unit before, Sergeant Nook decided to investigate the water source again, leaving the other sergeant at the tent. Upon arriving at the water source, he looked back and saw the shadow of Jackal walking away with an old man dressed in white, resembling a Brahmin. They both disappeared into the trees. Sergeant Nook thought it might be a hallucination caused by fear and continued to the water source. There, he saw what he thought were combat boot prints and a knife similar to one Jackal had previously. He picked up the knife to show the other sergeant when he returned to the tent. Upon reaching the tent and telling the other sergeant about the knife, they decided to return to the water source. However, when they arrived, the footprints were no longer there. They decided to wait at the water source, confident that Jackal might have gone into the water. By around 6 a.m., the first light of day hit the forest, and Sergeant Nook noticed a military shirt floating on the water. This made him more certain it was Jackal's shirt. Fortunately, the group he had seen the night before returned, and it turned out they were soldiers sent to help. Sergeant Nook asked them why they had not responded to the call. The soldiers said they had not heard anything, and even the campfire they passed was not visible. They reached the spot where Sergeant Nook's group had stayed. They decided to return when they saw no one there and met Sergeant Nook. Sergeant Nook informed the rescue team about Jackal's traces leading into the water. They searched for Jackal for about 2 hours but could not find him. Sergeant Nook decided to borrow a vehicle from the rescue team to drive to a village they had contacted before entering the forest, about 7 kilometers away, and asked the other soldiers to wait at the water source. Upon reaching the village, Sergeant Nook explained the situation to a hunter, who advised him that he had warned against going into the forest. The hunter mentioned that during the forest closure period, spirits and ghosts were abundant, and they should not have gone fishing or cutting branches as it could disturb the spirits. Sergeant Nook requested the hunter to accompany him back into the forest. Upon reaching a point where the vehicle could not go further, they continued on foot to the water source. The hunter then told Sergeant Nook that there was nothing left. This statement startled Sergeant Nook, and the hunter suggested that it might be too late. When they arrived at the water source, they learned from the divers that Jackal's body was found submerged. The hunter added that he had advised against entering the forest from the beginning and recommended waiting instead of training at that time. He noted that late November was a time of transition from rainy to cold season, making it a period when the forest was closed. If they had trained in April, there would have been no problem. All the soldiers at the site agreed to inform Jackal's family, request a ritual to invite his spirit back. The hunter concluded with a statement about the significance of respecting such warnings. People said that there was no need for the ceremony here. You won't go anywhere. Do you know where he is? Even though he died in the water, we still don't know where he was taken. We must go to the place where this incident began to perform the ritual. That morning's events made everyone anxious. They had to take the hunter, the monks, and others involved to the water source where they used to fish, which was about 1 kilometer away from the incident site. However, the hunter said this might not be the place, so they had to hike up the mountain eventually. It became nighttime again. This time, there were many people and they set up a watch shift after setting up camp. In the middle of the night, the hunter suddenly woke everyone up, telling them to leave immediately and not stay there. Even though it would soon be dawn, everyone had to rub their sleepy eyes and quickly leave the place. While they were leaving, the hunter explained that there was a sound of people walking around the area. They were sleeping, which was the same thing that Nook's group had encountered earlier. Nook explained to the hunter that they had entered the forest just to train, not with any malicious intent. At that moment, the hunter said they had to resolve the issue at the source. They walked up the mountain to the tree where the hunter had urinated before. The hunter then said that this was the sacred tree of the village and asked if they didn't know. The hunters set up offerings for the ritual and prayed that if what had happened required a life, they hoped the spirit would be released and not be trapped there. After calling out the name, the hunter asked the spirit to follow the thread and then walk down the mountain with the monks, who held the thread tied to the tree. As they reached the foot of the mountain, it was nighttime again. The hunter said they could not leave the forest yet and needed to perform a ritual to open the forest and apologize. Otherwise, there could be future problems. Everyone reluctantly had to stay another night in the forest. In the middle of the night, one of the soldiers suddenly sat up and spoke in a firm tone, saying, "You will never get out of here as long as I haven't cleared the way for you. I will take you one by one." By hearing this, the monk preached to the entity possessing the soldier. Once the monk finished preaching, the soldier's body sat down and bowed to apologize. The monk then said that, since the soldier was like this, he should be allowed to return home. Suddenly, the soldier regained his consciousness. When the situation calmed down, the monk went back to sleep. The next morning, everyone safely exited the forest, and the relatives of the deceased came to retrieve the body for religious rites. The sounds Nook's group heard earlier were a warning that they should not have stayed there. Everyone chose to continue with their task, leading to the events described earlier. After listening to Nook's story, it is another tale that feels exciting with the events that occurred, even though some parts may seem illogical. However, that's the nature of these stories. There is no need to search for answers if these events happen in reality. I deeply sympathize with the relatives of the deceased.